He lost his son and bought a house behind a waterfall, the very one the boy had dreamed of. But when the dog found a hiding place in the wall, he realized that his son's death was not accidental. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The mountain road twisted upward through fog that seemed alive, curling around the tires of the old truck like restless ghosts. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and stone, and every turn carried the echo of rushing water. Behind the wheel, Michael Reed drove in silence, his hands steady, his eyes hollow. In the passenger seat, a black German shepherd sat upright, its gaze fixed ahead. The dog's name was Shadow, a name that had once made his son laugh. Now it was all that followed him wherever he went. The name, the sound of it, the memory. He had not spoken much during the drive, and there was no need to. The world around him seemed determined to stay quiet. It was the kind of silence that stretched far enough to make a man feel like he'd been erased, the kind of silence he had been searching for since the night his son died. The fog thinned for a moment, and through it, he caught sight of the narrow bridge ahead. Wooden planks slick with rain, leading toward a cliffside draped in white water. Beyond the waterfall, half hidden by rock and mist, stood the house. Michael slowed the truck, cutting the engine as he rolled to a stop. For a while, he just sat there, listening to the rhythmic thunder of falling water. He had seen this place once before, not in person, but in the glossy pages of a magazine his son Andrew had found years ago. The boy had pointed to the photo, his eyes wide with wonder, and said, "That's where peace must live." At the time, Michael had smiled, too busy packing for another contract overseas to think much about what the words meant. Now, standing on the edge of the same dream, he felt a strange pull in his chest, something between ache and belonging. He stepped out of the truck and whistled softly. Shadow leapt down beside him, sniffing the damp air before shaking rain from its fur. Together they crossed the bridge, their boots and paws echoing faintly over the roar of the waterfall. The entrance to the path lay just beyond a curtain of mist. Water clung to the cliffs in silver threads, the air so cool it stung his lungs. He ducked beneath a low overhang and found himself in a hollow carved into the stone itself. There, behind the falling sheet of water, stood the house, a two-story structure of timber and stone, its frame leaning slightly with age, yet still strong enough to hold its ground. He unlocked the front door. The hinges moaned as though waking from a long sleep. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and moss. Light filtered through narrow windows, cutting thin lines through the darkness. Furniture lay scattered beneath sheets of grime. A heavy oak table, a bookshelf with warped spines, a cracked mirror reflecting only fragments of his face. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, and in that sound, he heard a kind of heartbeat, a pulse in the stillness. For the first time in years, he exhaled without feeling the weight of the world pressing back. That night, he built a fire in the stone hearth. The flames flickered against the walls, revealing carvings in the beams. Small, careful marks left by someone long ago. He sat beside the fire with a tin cup of coffee, the dog stretched at his feet. On the mantel stood a single photograph, one he had carried in his jacket for months. Andrew, smiling in the sun, his hair a mess from the wind, holding the leash that led to a younger, smaller Shadow. The picture was faded, but the boy's eyes still burned bright. Michael touched the frame, tracing the outline of his son's face, and whispered, "We made it, kid." Days passed. He fixed the roof where the moss had eaten through the shingles, replaced the rusted hinges on the windows, cleaned the soot from the fireplace. The work gave him purpose, something to fill the hours that had stretched empty since his retirement. Yet every evening, when the sun dipped and the light turned copper, the the silence returned. Thicker, closer, filled with memories that refused to fade. He would hear the echoes of boots in sand, the crack of distant gunfire, the screams that had followed him home from every place that wasn't meant to exist on a map. He'd spent half his life fighting battles for people who forgot his name. The other half he spent trying to remember his own. Shadow kept him anchored. The dog had been trained in detection and rescue, a remnant of the life he had tried to bury. She never barked without reason, never slept too deeply, and always positioned herself between Michael and the door. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would rise suddenly, her ears twitching toward the sound of the waterfall. Michael would wake instantly, his hand reaching instinctively for the pistol beneath the table. But there would be nothing, just the endless rush of water against rock. One morning, while clearing out the storage room at the back of the house, he noticed something strange. The wall behind a set of old crates seemed uneven. When he tapped it with his knuckles, it sounded hollow. He frowned, grabbed a crowbar, and pried loose one of the planks. Behind it was a narrow cavity lined with foil insulation. Inside lay several vacuum-sealed bags, stacked neatly on top of each other. He tore open the nearest one with a knife, revealing a white, crystalline powder that shimmered under the light. He froze. Years of experience told him exactly what it was. This was no abandoned stash from some drifter. It was fresh, deliberate, professional. Whoever left it here had known what they were doing. He sealed the bag again, his heartbeat quickening. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway, staring at the small, perfect pile of danger lying in the dark. Instinct said to burn it. Logic said to call the police. But something deeper, something older, told him to wait. He had seen setups like this before, back when he worked for men who played with lives like pieces on a board. He closed the wall, replaced the crates, and sat on the porch with Shadow. The dog rested her head on his knee, but her body was tense, her eyes never leaving the tree line. Michael rubbed her neck absent-mindedly, his mind already turning through possibilities. Someone had chosen this house for a reason. Maybe the sale was too easy, the paperwork too clean. Maybe peace had never been part of the bargain. By the second week, he began noticing signs. Tire tracks on the dirt road that hadn't been there before, a faint reflection in the hills at night, as if someone was watching with binoculars. Once, he caught the glint of metal near the waterfall's edge, but when he climbed to investigate, there was nothing, just the echo of his own breathing. Shadow grew restless, pacing the floor, whining softly when he tried to reassure her. It was late afternoon when the first visitors came. A dark SUV pulled up near the bridge, its tires crunching on gravel. Two men in suits stepped out, carrying clipboards and plastic badges. They claimed to be from the forestry department, checking property lines. Their smiles were polite, but didn't reach their eyes. One of them asked if he had noticed any unusual shipments arriving in the area. The other scanned the house behind Michael with quick, measuring glances. Michael kept his tone even, his expression blank. "Just me and the dog," he said. "No shipments. No visitors." They nodded, left a card, and drove away. But their tires left deep marks in the mud, like tracks carved for memory. That night, he didn't light the fire. He sat by the window instead, watching the forest disappear into the dark. The waterfall glowed faintly under the moon, a silver curtain against the black rock. Shadow lay beside him, alert, but still. Somewhere beyond that curtain, he could almost feel eyes on him. The old instinct stirred in his chest, the one he'd buried years ago when he swore never to fight again. But the truth was already whispering through the noise of the water. He hadn't found peace here. He'd been led here. Someone had chosen this place for him. He rose slowly, moving to the door, feeling the weight of the pistol at his side. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and pine. He stepped onto the bridge and looked back at the house, its windows glowing faintly from the lantern inside. The sound of the waterfall filled his ears until it drowned out every thought, every regret, every memory that had chased him from the world. And then, beneath that roar, he spoke softly to himself, to the darkness, to the ghosts that never left. "You wanted silence, Michael," he said. "Now listen to it." Shadow stood beside him, her eyes catching the moonlight, her body rigid with awareness. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped. Michael didn't flinch. The night was alive again, and he knew, as surely as he had ever known anything, that his time in hiding was over. The house behind the waterfall had given him what he asked for, but it had also awakened something he thought he'd buried with his son. The past was coming, and this time it had found him at home. The following days settled into a rhythm of unease. Michael woke early each morning, not because of habit, but because his instincts refused to let him rest. The dog had begun to patrol the house as if on command, circling each room before lying down by the door. Even the waterfall's steady roar, once a comfort, began to sound like static, hiding something beneath it. Every sound in the house had weight: the crack of wood in the night, the hollow drip from the ceiling, the wind that pressed against the windows like a slow, deliberate breath. He knew the feeling too well. He was being watched. He started with the paperwork. The sale documents for the house had arrived through an online broker, the transaction handled by an agency claiming to represent abandoned government properties. At the time, the low price had seemed a miracle. Now it looked like bait. Michael sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the papers, examining the seals and signatures by lamplight. The notary's name, Ellen K. Travers, looked familiar, but when he searched the database from his encrypted laptop, the name didn't exist. The signature itself had been digitally stamped, copied from a different contract entirely. Someone had built this purchase around him, leaving no trail but his own fingerprints. By midday, he had retraced the sale through 3 shell companies, each dissolved within weeks of being formed. The last trace led to a holding entity Solcom Group. The name hit him like a nail through the chest. He hadn't thought of Gary Solomon in years, not since the desert days when they worked for private clients, under governments that preferred not to know their names. Solomon had been his employer, his handler, and eventually his liability. They had parted badly after a mission that had gone wrong, an operation to secure a convoy that ended with civilian deaths, and a cover-up Michael refused to sign off on. He'd walked away. Solomon had called him a coward. Now Solomon's name was sitting at the end of a chain that led directly to his front door. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The light outside had begun to fade, turning the room the color of gunmetal. Shadow lifted her head, sensing the shift in his breathing. Michael scratched behind her ear. "You remember Solomon?" he muttered. The dog tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting in the half-light. "Yeah, me too." That night he didn't sleep. He walked through the rooms in the dark, bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, memorizing every creak, every corner. It was a habit from his old life: know the terrain, and you control the field. At dawn, he took the truck into the nearest town. The gas station attendant barely looked up when he paid cash for a burner phone, a roll of wire, and batteries. On the way back, he stopped at a hardware store for motion sensors and solar lamps. The clerk asked if he was setting up a cabin. "Something like that," Michael said. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the house had changed. He strung tripwires along the tree line, set small bells in the brush, installed cameras scavenged from his old gear. From the outside, the place looked untouched. From the inside, it had become a trap. Every entrance had an exit. Every room had a line of sight. The habits of a soldier, the instincts of a survivor, things he thought he'd buried years ago, had returned as naturally as breathing. Shadow followed him everywhere, padding silently beside him. Once, while setting a camera near the bridge, she froze, ears pricked. Michael crouched beside her. Through the rain-soaked leaves, he saw the faint outline of boot prints. Fresh. Deep. Too large to be his own. They led from the road toward the house, then vanished near the rocks. Whoever was watching him wasn't careless. They wanted him to know. Inside, he opened the closet and stared at the wall where he'd found the first stash. The boards he'd nailed back looked untouched, but he could almost feel the weight behind them. He'd considered calling the sheriff, but small-town law enforcement wasn't equipped for something this clean. They'd call the DEA. The DEA would call the Bureau. And by then, Solomon's people would have rewritten the story. He needed proof. Something undeniable. The second discovery came by accident. Shadow had begun scratching at the floor near the staircase, whining softly. At first he thought she smelled rodents, but when he pulled up the boards, the air that rose from below carried not dust, but cold metal. Beneath the planks lay a box, sealed tight, the kind of container used for military field intel aluminum, waterproof, and coated with a digital lock. Michael pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were several flash drives, a stack of bank ledgers, and a thick folder marked with 3 red letters. Solcom. The pages inside were meticulous contracts, shipping manifests, transaction IDs, and offshore account details. His name appeared only once, on an outdated personnel form, long before he quit. But the rest painted the full picture. Weapons transfers disguised as medical aid, narcotics moved through military supply routes, and payments to names he recognized from every war that had never been officially fought. And at the center of it all, Gary Solomon's signature dozens of times, precise and unmistakable. Michael closed the folder, the old rage stirring like embers in his chest. So that was the truth. The drugs hidden in his wall weren't random contraband. They were his leverage, a setup designed to erase him while destroying the last trail that could expose Solomon's empire. He had been turned into a ghost that could take the fall for a crime he hadn't committed. For the first time since his son's death, he felt something close to clarity. The past wasn't finished with him, but maybe, for once, he had a chance to finish it. He spent the next day digitizing the documents, encrypting them across several drives. The air inside the house grew heavier, charged with purpose. Outside, the weather had shifted. The rain thickened into sheets that blurred the world into movement and shadow. It reminded him of the jungles in Africa, where noise was constant, and silence meant death. He caught his reflection in the window, gray-haired, unshaven, his face carved into hard lines. There was no soldier left there, no mercenary, no father. Only a man who had been given a second chance to do something that mattered. By nightfall, he had an idea. There was one man he could still reach, an old contact from his security days who had left the field to join the FBI. Jeff Sloan. The last time they'd spoken was years ago, after the convoy incident. Sloan had told him to disappear before someone made him disappear. He'd listened. Now, he typed the number into the burner phone and waited. The call went unanswered. He tried again. Nothing. He sent a message with one line. Solcom's still alive. Evidence in hand. Then he turned off the phone and placed it on the counter. If Sloan was still on the inside, he'd know what to do. The reply came the next evening. A single text, unsigned. Stay put. We've been watching him too. No name, no coordinates. But it was enough. He sat on the porch, the waterfall roaring a few feet away, and felt the weight of everything pressing down. The isolation, the danger, the strange sense that the house itself was listening. Shadow lay across his boots, head lifted. Her ears flicked toward the sound of the forest, every nerve alert. We've got company coming, he said quietly, "but they don't know what kind." The following morning brought fog thick as smoke. Michael woke before dawn, his senses humming. He checked the cameras. Nothing. The footage showed only mist and the shimmer of water. But when he stepped outside, he saw footprints, again, closer this time. Damp impressions leading up to the porch and then away. Whoever was circling him wanted him cautious, not dead. Yet. He brewed coffee, sat by the window, and thought of Andrew. His son had been the only person who saw through him, not the soldier or the killer, but the man beneath. The boy had dreamed of living in the wild, surrounded by waterfalls and trees. He used to draw pictures of it, the two of them with shadow between them, the world quiet, safe. Now here he was, in the dream his son had left behind, guarding it like a soldier guarding an outpost. The day stretched long. He spent it cleaning his weapons, checking ammunition he'd sworn never to use again. When the rain let up, he climbed to the ridge above the waterfall. From there, he could see the road snaking through the trees. A black SUV sat parked half a mile down, engine idling. He watched it for an hour, memorizing its license plate before it disappeared into the fog. That night, the call came. Sloane's voice was low, controlled, and older than he remembered. "You really do have a talent for digging graves you don't want to lie in," he said. "Solomon's been under investigation for years. We've been waiting for something like this." Michael asked if the Bureau could protect him. Sloane laughed without humor. "Protect you? No. We can use you, but it has to be your choice." The conversation ended with a promise. Sloane would send coordinates for a drop. If Michael could get the evidence there, it might be enough to open a case. But Michael knew what that meant, turning himself into bait. He looked at the waterfall through the window, its motion endless, merciless. He thought of all the places he'd escaped, all the wars that had ended with him walking away. Maybe this one wouldn't. He encrypted the files one last time, setting them to upload to a secure cloud server with a 48-hour delay. If he died, they would send automatically to Sloane's address. Insurance. He switched off the laptop and sat in the dark, the sound of the waterfall filling the house like a heartbeat. Shadow stirred beside him, lifting her head at a noise he couldn't hear. He smiled faintly, the first real smile in years. "He doesn't know about you," he said. "He doesn't know I've got a shadow." The dog wagged her tail once, then settled back down. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley, echoing against the cliffs. The storm grew heavier through the night. Each gust of wind sent water spraying through the cracks in the stone. Michael moved through the rooms one final time, checking his traps, his exits, his angles. The soldier inside him was awake again, and the silence that once felt like peace now felt like readiness. He wasn't running anymore. He was waiting. By dawn, the storm had cleared, leaving the forest steaming in silver. The sky was pale and cold, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth. Michael stood by the waterfall, watching the current surge past the rocks. He could feel the decision solidify in him like stone. This wouldn't be a battle for survival. It would be a reckoning. The man who'd built his life on violence had come full circle to the place where his son had dreamed of peace. The irony wasn't lost on him. The only way to keep that dream pure was to face the darkness he'd helped create. He turned toward the house. The dog followed, silent, loyal, ready. Together they stepped through the doorway, into the dim light that flickered across the wooden floor, and the plan began to take shape. The time for hiding was over. The past had found him behind the waterfall, and now it would end here. The day began like the stillness before a storm. The forest surrounding the waterfall had gone quiet, unnaturally so, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Michael woke before sunrise, the air inside the house sharp and cold, his mind already calculating distances, angles, and escape routes. The fog that rolled in from the river below had swallowed the world in pale gray. He could barely see the bridge through the window, only the faint shimmer of water moving in the early light. Shadow was already awake, her dark eyes fixed on the door, her ears twitching with a tension that mirrored his own. They both knew that silence could mean only one thing. It was almost time. He spent the morning preparing, each movement deliberate and soundless. The years of discipline came back with mechanical precision. He tightened the screws on the cameras, checked the power cells, adjusted the sensors so they would trigger with even the faintest motion. The house was no longer a place of refuge. It was an extension of his instincts, a structure made of wood, stone, and intent. Every door had been reinforced, every entry point monitored. Behind the waterfall, the air smelled of rain and steel. He had turned the dream of peace his son once imagined into something else entirely, a fortress. He had no illusions about what was coming. Solomon's men would not come quietly. They would arrive with force, confident that fear and surprise would do their work for them. Michael had lived that pattern too many times to mistake it. The only advantage he held now was that he understood how they thought, how they moved, and how to turn their arrogance against them. He set traps with the patience of a man who no longer expected to survive the day, but was determined to make it count. Fishing lines stretched across hallways, pressure plates hidden beneath loose boards, motion detectors masked beneath dust and cobwebs. To anyone entering, the house would seem abandoned, harmless until it wasn't. By noon, the air was thick with humidity. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavy, the kind of rain that muffles sound and blurs sight. Perfect cover. Michael sat by the window, his rifle resting across his knees. The forest was a blur of green and gray, but through the mist he could sense the movement, subtle but unmistakable. The birds that had been nesting near the cliffs were gone. Even the waterfall seemed quieter, as if it too was listening. Shadow rose suddenly, her muscles taut, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Michael placed a hand on her back, steadying her. "Not yet," he whispered. The first vehicle appeared just after 3. Black, windowless, crawling up the muddy road with the careful patience of men who had done this before. Another followed, and another, until 3 SUVs stood at the edge of the bridge. From the lead car stepped Gary Solomon. He looked older, heavier than Michael remembered, but his posture still carried the same arrogance, the same confidence of a man who had always paid others to fight his battles. He raised a hand, and his men began to spread out, weapons drawn, moving toward the house with practiced formation. Michael watched from the shadows, counting them 6 men, not including Solomon. Enough to kill him twice over. Enough to make them overconfident. He waited until the first of them reached the porch. The man stepped carefully, scanning the area with a small flashlight. When his foot pressed against the loose plank Michael had placed the night before, a sharp metallic click echoed beneath the rain. There was a flash of light, then a deafening crack. The explosion was small but violent, throwing the intruder backward into the mud. The others shouted, scrambling for cover. Michael stayed still. He could see Solomon's face twist in anger as he barked orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of the waterfall. They moved again, slower now, splitting into pairs. 2 approached from the left side of the house, 1 from the rear. Michael adjusted the rifle's sight and fired once. The sound vanished into the thunder of water, but one man dropped instantly, disappearing into the brush. Shadow darted forward as the second man came through the side window, shattering glass and rain into the air. The dog struck with a ferocity born of loyalty and training, bringing him down before he could raise his weapon. The gun discharged wildly, splintering the doorframe. Michael moved from room to room, every motion fluid, controlled. He could feel his heart pounding, but his breathing remained calm even. The house was alive now, its every corner humming with movement and danger. For a moment, he could almost hear his old commander's voice in his head, teaching him how to fight in close quarters, how to turn chaos into rhythm. The battle inside the house lasted minutes that felt like hours. When it was over, 3 men lay unmoving. One fled into the trees, and the sound of the waterfall was once again the only noise left. Solomon was still outside. Michael saw him through the rain, standing near his car, his coat drenched, his face pale but composed. He was holding a pistol, though it looked unnatural in his hand. He was not a man built for confrontation. He was built for control. And now that control was slipping away. Michael stepped onto the porch, the rain drenching him instantly. His weapon hung loosely at his side. "It's over, Gary," he called out, his voice steady, cutting through the storm. "You can walk away, but you'll never hide again." Solomon's eyes narrowed. "You think this makes you clean?" he shouted back. "You're just another ghost, Michael, a killer who got tired of being paid. You think anyone cares which of us burns first?" Michael didn't answer. He raised his rifle slightly, not as a threat, but as a reminder. "You made one mistake," he said. "You came here yourself." Solomon's hand trembled, the barrel of his gun wavering. "You don't have the guts," he spat. "You never did." Michael almost smiled. "You're right. That's why I'm still alive." He pressed a small button on the remote in his pocket. Across the property, the hidden cameras lit up, sending a live feed to the encrypted channel he had set days earlier. Every word, every gunshot, every face was being recorded and transmitted. The files were already uploading to the Bureau's servers, including the documents he'd found beneath the stairs. "You were always predictable, Gary," he said quietly, "and predictable men don't survive long." Solomon fired first, the bullet slicing through the air and splintering the doorframe beside Michael's head. The second shot never came. Shadow lunged forward, knocking Solomon off balance, sending his gun skittering into the mud. The two fell together, a blur of movement and sound. Michael rushed forward, pulling the dog back. Solomon lay on the ground, gasping, mud streaking his face, his expression twisted between rage and disbelief. "You think they'll let you live after this?" he wheezed. "You've exposed them all." Michael looked down at him, rain running into his eyes. Maybe that's the point. He tied Solomon's hands with a cable, dragging him beneath the shelter of the porch. The man struggled weakly, but the fight was gone from him. Michael knelt beside him, his voice low. "Everything's already sent. The Bureau has it. You'll spend the rest of your life explaining what you did. That's more punishment than anything I could do to you." Solomon looked up, his face slack with defeat. "You'll die for this." Michael stood. "Probably," he said, "but not today." Shadow whimpered beside him. When he looked down, he saw blood darkening the dog's fur near her shoulder. The sight hit him harder than any bullet. He pressed a hand against the wound, whispering softly, his voice breaking for the first time that day. "Easy, girl, easy. We're almost done." He carried her inside, laying her near the fire he'd built that morning. The warmth flickered across the room, mingling with the smell of smoke and rain. The house was quiet again, but not empty. It felt alive, as if it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. When the flashing lights appeared through the mist an hour later, Michael didn't move to greet them. The sound of helicopters and sirens was distant, muffled by the waterfall's steady roar. He sat beside Shadow, his hand resting on her side, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breathing. The agents entered cautiously, weapons drawn, But when they saw Solomon bound on the porch and the evidence spread across the table, their stances shifted from aggression to disbelief. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. "You did it," he said. Michael didn't look up. "No," he answered quietly. "I just stayed alive long enough." Days passed before the house was cleared, before the reports were filed and the bodies removed. The Bureau took Solomon away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling behind him. They called Michael a witness, a survivor, a reluctant hero. He rejected every title. When they offered protection, he refused. He had lived under shadows long enough. He didn't need another name to hide behind. He returned to the house once the noise faded, the bridge repaired, the windows replaced. The waterfall still thundered beside him, the sound no longer menacing, but constant, grounding. Months later, the season began to turn. The air grew warmer, the trees thick with leaves, and the water ran clearer than before. Michael planted a small maple tree in the patch of soil near the porch. Beneath it, he placed a simple wooden sign, hand-carved with steady, deliberate letters. Andrew's Place. Each morning he sat beside it with a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air, Shadow resting her head against his boot. The wound had healed, leaving a faint scar beneath her fur. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he thought he could hear his son's laughter in the water, a sound half memory, half illusion. He didn't think of the past much anymore. The wars, the missions, the men like Solomon, they had all become distant, their edges blurred by time. What remained was this: the rhythm of the waterfall, the warmth of the fire at night, the steady companionship of the dog who had never abandoned him. The house, once a trap, had become something else, a testament not to survival, but to endurance. On the final evening of that summer, he stood by the waterfall as the sun sank behind the cliffs. The sky glowed gold, and the air shimmered with mist. Shadow stood beside him, her coat gleaming in the fading light. He looked at the house, its windows glowing softly, and felt a peace that wasn't fragile anymore. It wasn't silence born of grief or hiding. It was the kind that comes when a man has faced everything there is to face, and found, at last, that he is still standing. He spoke quietly, almost to himself, the sound barely rising above the water. "You were right, kid," he said. "It's quiet here." Then he turned back toward the house, the dog following at his side, and disappeared into the warm, steady glow that waited beyond the door. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that stay with you. Watch the next one waiting for you right now, and share this video with someone who still believes every place can hold a secret.